Well, good morning. Can you hear me? That's the first question. If anyone was here yesterday, who was here yesterday? Hands up. Yeah. So you'll know all about Hairgate. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I went with the half-tail look, which caused a bit of a problem when poor Dave tried to put the Britney mic on me because it wouldn't work. So we went with the handheld yesterday. So today I put my hair up because I thought really that's the only way. But at any moment, they can fall off my ears. Just be prepared, that's all I'm saying. So it's just fantastic to be back here. Thank you so much to Andrew for welcoming me and asking me in the first place. And yesterday, your hospitality was so warm and so welcoming. I felt immediately at home, and the same is true again today, so thank you so much. Now, yesterday was great for lots of reasons. Lots of my very favourite things came together. I went somewhere new, even though I've known about the Nansen Road Baptist for years. I know people who come here. I've got a family member who lives 2 roads away, and never once have I set foot in the place, which is a shocking omission, and I can only apologise. I love somewhere new, I love meeting new people, and yesterday you gave me an absolutely magnificent afternoon tea. Now I know I'm not here talking about holy things, but I feel that scones and cream and jam very much fall into that category, so thank you very much. So, really, the theme of my talk today is generosity, and to illustrate that, you won't be surprised to hear that I'm going to be telling you some stories. That's my job. For those of you who don't know me, these days my full-time job is that I'm a fiction author. I also write for lots of Christian charities. I'm a speaker, I'm an editor, I talk for the WI. So standing up and telling stories is very much my thing. And of course, as we know, all the best stories are found in the Bible. So, some of you met my husband yesterday at the tea. Now, he hasn't yet come to his own personal faith, but he is the one who gave me the idea for the talk today. You know, when you get asked to do this kind of thing, you think long and hard and you pray and you say, Lord, give me something. And I had said this several times and nothing had come through. I was like, okay, it's fine, we've still got some weeks. And then I was driving along in the car with my husband and he just started chatting about his great aunt Sis, who I've often heard about. Never met her because unfortunately she died before we got together. But he really loved Aunt Sis. He often talked about her. Now, she was a spinster, she never married, but we pieced some news together about her, and we think she must have had a very traumatic and sad past. We think that when she was young, she became pregnant, and because she was born in the 1890s, she was forced to give that child away. Now, we don't know that, but certainly all the evidence points that way. So by the time my husband was born, she was an elderly lady, never married, didn't have a child as far as we know living with her. And she was quite isolated and seemed to be, didn't really quite fit in the family. She lived with her sisters. And my husband just has the most wonderful memories of going to see Great Aunt Sis in Eastbourne. He would go into the house and Great Aunt Sis would come down the stairs and she'd say, oh, I didn't know you were coming. I'm so pleased to see you. And she would run upstairs and come down with pennies. Now back then, I suppose in the 70s, a penny went quite a long way. Some of you can probably remember going to the sweetie shop with a penny. I can. I mean, goodness me, half pennies, you could even get some for a half penny. So if you had a whole penny, that was good. So she would come down the stairs with all these pennies she'd been saving. Now she wasn't a rich woman, far from it. She lived on a tiny pension. And she would wrap each individual penny into a piece of paper and she would give them to my husband, and he thought this was marvellous. And the other thing about Aunt Sis was that it was it's quite a fractured family. So my late father-in-law never really felt very welcomed or very loved or seen. But Sis was the only one, and he used to tell me this, she was the only one who made him feel like he was welcome. She would say, oh, John, I'm so glad to see you, and give him a big hug, and he always spoke so warmly of her. Now the thing is, Auntie Sis, I'm speaking about those words today, and you've heard of her now. She never really did anything particularly in life. She died, an elderly lady, by herself, which is really sad, but her name has lived on, and it's connected with generosity, and that's what kicked me off to give this talk today. So, as we get going, I'd like to share a quote from C.S. Lewis with you, and he said this: I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. Now that's quite a scary thing, isn't it? Being told to give more than we can spare. You know, you might look at your bank statements, I often do, and think, okay, that's interesting, none of those numbers add up. They might be in red. Yes, they are. How am I going to make it through the month? Logically, you know, if you were a non-Christian, you'd say that's a load of old hooey, C.S. Lewis. Don't be silly, you should never give more than you can spare. But that's the whole point of Christianity, it's countercultural. We're doing something that to the world looks ludicrous. What do you mean you're giving more than you should spare? But I love those words, and they really spoke to me. And I think today particularly, that's a real challenge. You know, we are living in a time of real economic hardship and uncertainty in the world. But I don't think Lewis is just talking about money. There are lots of ways that all of us can be really radically generous through giving freely of our time perhaps, or our talents, and really looking out for those nudges from God. As an example, yesterday when I turned up, I was welcomed really warmly by people who had never met me in their lives. That's a great start. I came in, everyone was lovely to me, there was a wonderful feeling in the room. You know, I've been to a lot of churches in my time. This is a really lovely, welcoming one. That's a huge talent. What a gift. And then, as I've mentioned before, and will probably mention again, I was lavished with calories. It was great. It was great. Thank you. That's a talent of hospitality. It felt wonderful, and you were giving freely to me, a stranger in your midst. Just remember that and be encouraged. So, Suzanne, I gave her a nice, easy scripture, a nice short one, and I went for the Message rather than the NIV, because having looked at the two translations, I just love the words that we used in the Message. It spoke really clearly to me. And to look at what we're talking about today, we need to examine Luke chapter 20, which begins thus. One day, he, that's Jesus, was teaching the people in the temple, proclaiming the message. The high priests, religion scholars, and leaders confronted him. That's an interesting word, isn't it? Confronted him. And demanded, there's another interesting word, show us your credentials. Who authorised you to speak and act like this? Now I'm feeling some wacky fingers coming on at this point. I'm not a fan of the wacky finger. I'm not a fan of people coming up to me and demanding things and asking for my credentials. This is not pleasant language, particularly not in the temple. What if I showed up yesterday at Nansen Road for the first time, and one of those nice ladies said, who are you? Show us your credentials, you know. Email for a day, all that too, you know. This is not Christ-like behaviour, I would suggest. And when I really dug into the chapter, the whole thing is like a back and forth between Jesus and the high priests and the scholars. Now these people just love the letter of the law. They're really legalistic. Great people to be around, I'm sure. We all love those sort of people. And as we know, they were trying to trip up this inspirational rabbi and teacher. Why? Because they felt threatened. How many times do we see that in our life today? We could probably point to 5 or 6 stories in the press this week about people feeling threatened and acting accordingly. And that's what these men, because they were all men, that's what they were doing. They felt the temple was their property, and this shabby bloke from Galilee was standing there saying all this radical stuff, and they didn't like it. So they asked him, demanded, what are your credentials? Why are you speaking to us like this? So he immediately takes control. There's no nonsense with Jesus. If he came to talk at Nansen Road, I'll tell you what, I would be here immediately. He's a great speaker. He says, okay then, about the baptism of John, who authorised it, heaven or humans? Now that's quite a tricky question, and I love the way the Message tells us how these people responded. So don't forget, these people are top of the tree in their society. They're rich, they're powerful, they know it all, people are quite scared of them. They were on the spot, and they knew it. They pulled back into a huddle and whispered. Look at that, they whispered, they didn't speak out loud. Why do people do that? Because they're threatened. If we say heaven, he'll ask us why we didn't believe him. If we say humans, the people will tear us limb from limb, convinced as they are that John was God's prophet. They agreed to concede that round to Jesus and said they didn't know. Jesus said, then neither will I answer your question. Fantastic arguing wordplay logic there. Now he's not being rude to them, he's not abusing them, but he has put them in their place. And remember, this chapter is being played out in the temple in front of lots of people. Imagine Nansen Road and multiply it by, I don't know, 20 and fill it up with people. Everyone can hear this guy talking to these terribly important people who go around telling everybody else what to do. Hold that thought. And that, of course, sets the tone for the whole chapter. Now, looking into the background, it's really important, I think. I like it when I'm listening to a talk to know where we are. So today, I'm in Nansen Road, I'm on the estate that was built in the 20s, I'm on my side of Ipswich, which is handy, as I come up the A12, this is the right side for me. Nothing against the other side of Ipswich, lovely in its own way, obviously. But for me, that's good. I know quite a lot about this area, I've driven through it lots of times. If I said to somebody where I was going, which I did in a week, somebody made a bit of a face and went, "Oh, you're going there?" I was like, "Yeah." They went, "Are you sure?" I was like, not the church, can I just say, the area. I was like, "Yeah." They're like, "Okay." I'm like, right. So, there's that sort of feeling of where you come from. If someone tells me they live near Christchurch Park, I will, I say this with love, I will immediately judge them. And I know judging is wrong. I'll think, "Oh, you must have loads of money." Do you know what I mean? You've got that shorthand. Obviously, does anyone live near Christchurch Park? Talk afterwards if you do. So this is interesting to know. Now, an itinerant rabbi from Nazareth, which is where Jesus comes from, everybody looked down on Nazareth. Everybody. It's like, oh, Nazareth. Somebody even says, "Can he could come from Nazareth?" They had a strong local dialect. So if you were a Nazarene, I think that's correct, or from Nazareth, and you opened your mouth, everyone knew where you came from. Like, "Oh, she's from Nazareth, he's from Nazareth." And people thought that was a bit below them. So for a start, he's talking with an accent that nobody likes. Everyone looks down on. His teachers of the law would have even more despised him because of this. So it is a bit like these people who live in huge houses in a particular part of Ipswich or wherever, wandering around there, looking down, look at this place. That's the sort of line we're getting here. Which of course we all love to hear, don't we? So Jesus has got the upper hand. Now it looks on the front of it, he shouldn't have the upper hand because he's from a place that nobody likes, he's a bit ragged perhaps, he's a rabbi that has suddenly appeared, but he keeps shutting down these people. He's not angry, he's not rude, and they will not give up. They keep coming back at him. So off he goes with his storytelling. So in chapter 20, he tells a couple of parables. The first one you'll be familiar with, the one about the vineyard owner who goes away on a journey and he leaves his farmhands to take care of business. Now, this is very clever stuff from Jesus because the religious leaders know that he's aiming this at them. This story is about them. But even so, they decide to hit him with the big one. I imagine there's some more whispering. What should we say now? And they go with taxes. Still very relevant today. A very painful subject for many of us, obviously. They try to trick him. And he tangles them up with clever words. Words of truth. And I love this for them. I just love that they can't seem to win. So next we have a group of Sadducees approaching him. Now I remember when I was at Girls' Brigade back in the day, and we were taught that the Sadducees were sad, you see, that's how we remember their name, because of what they believed in, sort of like that. Now they were even worse. They were so into the law and very rigid. You had to do everything in a certain way. So again, giving us some context, if I turned up yesterday and Hannah had been there in charge of the team, she was a Sadducee, it would not have been the relaxed and friendly atmosphere. Hannah would have been going around measuring the scones, I would imagine. Just an example, and say, no, insert the name of the person who made a scone here, Mary, I don't know if you've got Mary. This scone is a centimetre too large. You know the rules. She would take her, and she would find some sort of scroll, I'm thinking, in the office over there. She'd look at the scroll, which says about foodstuffs. It says that scones can only be 4 centimetres across. What have you got to say for yourself, Mary? And then maybe she would have shamed her in the service, and Mary would come ahead and say, "I'm so sorry about the sin around the scones," and everyone would be very angry and kept on talking about it. Well, that's ludicrous, isn't it? A scone's a scone. It doesn't matter. The bigger the better, I say. This is how the Sadducees work. Everything's rigid. You had to do it a certain way or something terrible would happen. Again, these people are no fun to be around. If they turned up yesterday, it would have been a bit of a tough one, I think. So this was what Sadducees were all about. So I'm guessing that the religious leaders have thought, "Oh, for goodness sake, no, we're not getting anywhere here. Call in the Sadducees. They'll sort it out." Now, the other thing about them was that they were not popular with the Jewish people. One, because I think they were just really boring and annoying, but secondly, because they were very pro the Romans. They liked working with them. And of course, the Romans were the invading force in this country, seen as the enemy, oppressors by everyone who lived there. So the Sadducees were kind of like the big guns that were being brought in at this point. So after some consultation, they decided to ask him about the rules of marriage. And this again was a bit of a tricky subject. But again, Jesus answers so cleverly that even some of these leaders were impressed. I absolutely love this. Against their will, I think, we're told. Some of the religion scholars said, "Teacher, that's a great answer." For a while, anyone, no one dared to put questions to him. So he shut them up for a bit, which is good news, but they're still going. So at the end of chapter 20, there's a thunderclap, storytelling-wise. So let's visualise Jesus in the temple, surrounded by all of the symbols of Judaism. Now he's got his disciples nearby, and an audience of ordinary people, plus these groups of rich and powerful leaders. Now let's imagine it's been about a couple of hours with the back and forth. He's listened to what they had to say, he's refuted it, they've been trying to trick him, he's kept at it. And then what Susanna read out for us at the end of the chapter, we read this. With everybody listening, so the whole temple is listening, Jesus spoke to his disciples. Now this is interesting. 1 minute he's talking to the religious leaders over here in their fine robes, and then he turns back to his disciples, who I imagine are not well-dressed men. They're fishermen, they're poor, they will be in raggedy robes, their hair, a bit of a mess. They don't fit in, they don't look like they should be there. Turns away from the richness and he goes towards the poor people and he says to them this: "Watch out for the religion scholars. They love to walk around in academic gowns, preen in the radiance of public flattery, bask in prominent positions, sit at the head table of every church function. And all the time they are exploiting the weak and helpless. The longer their prayers, the worse they get, but they'll pay for it in the end." Now this is fighting talk. You only have to think about where we are in the world today. There are lots of people who do exactly this. They go around talking and wanting all the best for themselves. They don't give two hoots about people like us. They don't care about people who are on universal credit, or on PIP, or who can't work, or who have got mental illness. They don't care at all. It's all about the look and what benefits them, which, as we know, is the exact opposite of everything faith is about. The exact opposite. And listen to what he says at the end. The longer their prayers, the worse they get. Yeah, you've all heard that. But they'll pay for it in the end. Which is quite consoling, I always find, because it's hard to watch people, just glide through life, everything's fine, they're horrible, they make loads of money, they never seem to be punished for what they do. And we do think, is there any justice in the world? Apparently there is going to be. Now the thing is, there's no wiggle room in what he says. You cannot interpret those words in any other way than the way he speaks them. And he's speaking about those people while they're still there. They're right here. They can hear him. They can see him. And just imagine the embarrassment and the rage they must be feeling. This man is flipping all the societal norms of their time and ours. The ordinary people must be thinking, wow, this is powerful stuff. So let's take the situation, let's move it forward 2,000 years to our time and our society. So I imagine it would be like Jesus now, wearing a pair of old jeans, maybe a sweatshirt with holes in it, hair and beard, a bit of a mess. And there he is standing outside the Shard in London, which is, a place of power and wealth. It's a great big glittering building full of amazing things. But outside he's talking to an audience of normal people like us. Plus there's a handful of politicians and billionaires and lawyers, let's say. People who are privileged and rich and influential and seem to have an easy ride while the rest of us struggle. Now, I'm not saying in any way that there's anything essentially wrong with politicians or billionaires or lawyers. I don't know if any of you fall into those categories. Speak to me afterwards. There isn't, it's not that. But as I've said before, quite often these people seem to just glide through life quite easily and nothing seems to ever affect them. And I often feel powerless when I see how much wickedness there is in the world and how the poorest and most vulnerable in society are suffering while others get rich. But this scripture does show us exactly what Jesus thinks about that situation. It's not about how much money you've got, it's how you use it. It's not about how much power you've got, it's how you use it. It's perfectly possible to be rich and powerful and yet to be loving and compassionate and live according to Jesus' teachings. So just with that in mind, and before we look at the first part of chapter 21, I want to take you back to 2011. My freelance writing career in the charity sector, the Christian charity sector, started in 2008 when I was writing the Share magazine, which was Stewardship's thrice yearly publication. So Stewardship's a big Christian charity, all about generosity, resourcing the kingdom and philanthropy. And I normally got to interview people for articles over the phone or on Zoom. And in my entire career, I only ever twice interviewed people face to face. And I want to tell you about both of them because they taught me so much about generosity and what we're talking about today. So in 2011, they're still quite new to me. I haven't been a writer very long. And they said, you're going to have to go to Luton Hoo. Anyone heard of Luton Hoo? It's a big place. Oh, blimey, it's a massive stately home in Bedfordshire. Huge great place. And it's not the kind of place I would normally find myself. At the time, I had 3 little children and hardly any money. Now the children are grown up, I still have hardly any money. Nothing has changed in that respect. So I was sent to interview this guy who was a billionaire, British billionaire and international businessman. And when I interviewed him, he had already, this is in 2011, given away £180 million. I know. Gosh, I was like, wow, I can't be professional, I think I'm now further than that point. And he said, my intention is, Ruth, he said, I want to give away 300 million before I die. I know. If it's any consolation to you, Mick, he did come from nothing, so, it wasn't that. Anyway, so this man was a very interesting guy. He was brought up as a Catholic, didn't really bother with God particularly, became a Christian at 17, and that's a story in itself. Married at 20, was a father by 22. And there was never enough money, they were poor. Worked for a British motor company, so this is in the 70s, time of British Leyland. That went bankrupt, but then he was given a £6,000 redundancy cheque, which I think this is 1976, that was a lot of money in 1976, you could buy a house. And he decided that he would invest and he would start a news company around motors. And he was the first man to import cars from the Far East into the UK. That's how he made his money. So by 1988, he was very, very rich indeed. And one night he had a dream. He said, I was standing in front of God and he asked me a direct question. What did you do with your life? You made lots of money, but what else? And when he woke up, he said, that's it, I've got to start giving away this money. And this is the thing he said to me, which I have never forgotten. He said, everybody in the world, he said, can be more generous than me. However much I give away, I'll always have more left than most people do. I was like, oh yeah, I suppose you will, because when you're a billionaire, it doesn't matter how much you give away, unless I suppose you give all of it away, you're always going to have more. And I think that's really interesting. I've met 2 billionaires in my life, and they were both extremely generous, and they were both Christians with a Catholic background, interestingly. But that's right, isn't it? I can be more generous than them with my constant overdraft and worrying about how I'm going to pay the bills, because I have much less money to give. I'm not a billionaire, I'm never going to be a billionaire. So he can be really radically generous, and he is. But any ordinary person can be more generous. It's weird, isn't it? But it really does make me think. So actually, the less money we have, the more radical generosity we can show when we trust in the Lord. I find that really encouraging as a person who hasn't got much. That's good. That's really good news. Of course, that's hard, and we need to be prayerful about our giving. But God always gives us a nudge when it's the right time, and he honours sacrificial generosity. So this guy also said to me, and I've never forgotten these words either, he said, it's about how much you're prepared to give away, not how much you've got in the first place. When God asks us to give, he said, whether it's money or time, we should obey. And that goes along with the C.S. Lewis quote. So let's get back to Luke 21, because this guy spoke to me about the widow's mite, which is that story. Just then he looked up, that's Jesus, and saw the rich people dropping offerings in a collection plate. Then he saw a poor widow put in 2 pennies. He said, the plain truth is that this widow has given by far the largest offering today. All these others made offerings they'll never miss. She gave extravagantly what she couldn't afford. She gave her all. Now that's exactly what this guy said to me. If you haven't got so much and you give it away, you're infinitely more generous than a billionaire who doesn't have to count the cost. Now this part of the chapter is not a parable or an illustration. This is Jesus, the charismatic rabbi with the Nazarene accent, looking up from what he's doing and seeing someone who is on the margin of society. You know, we all know how it went. Women weren't valued particularly. They were wives and mothers. That was kind of it. Although there are some examples in the New Testament of women who had started their own business and were independently wealthy, but that was rare. And a widow, especially if she was poor, was at the very bottom of the heap in that society. No one cared. No one noticed her. She just didn't matter. Now, I don't know if she had children. I had a look into this. I think if she had had children, they would have been looking after her. She wouldn't have been as poor. So I think we can assume that she was a childless widow, which is even worse. And yet she's seen. She's noticed by Jesus. She gave her all. So there's no safety net here. There's no social security or crowdfunding or social care. If you had no money, you didn't eat. That was it. And yet she's given 2 tiny coins. Let's imagine them as pennies, the sort of thing that Auntie Sis used to give to my husband. So let's put ourselves in her mind for a minute. Here she is in the temple. She's the lowest of the low, walking in behind these richly dressed people with their bags of gold coins, and she's looking at the floor. She wants to be invisible. Sadly, she probably is. So all these people are chattering loudly, and she's watching as they're pouring these coins into the plate, amounts of money it would have taken her husband a lifetime to earn. She cannot live up to their standards. She cannot do what they do. So perhaps she notices out in the corner of her eye this group of scruffily dressed men, and they don't seem to fit in either. That man at the front speaking must be a rabbi, but he doesn't look like any teacher she's ever seen. And maybe the wealthy people are nudging each other and tutting and doing the old side eye. Who's he? He's like bloke from Nazareth, sniggering. And she's like, oh, okay. And they say, Galilean fishermen in a temple. They've probably never seen anything like this in all their lives. Thank heavens we are who we are. Imagine having to get up before it's light, catch fish, smell. You can just imagine these people being vile. They're mocking and they're self-satisfied. And because I'm a storyteller, I thought, yeah, what's she thinking? I think she's going to be quite irreverent. She thinks, who do you think catches the fish that ends up on your table? Does it swim to your house by itself? And when her husband was alive, he used to roar with laughter when she said stuff like that. But it's no good going down that road. He's gone and he's never coming back. And meanwhile, here she is in the temple with 2 tiny coins that are pretty much valueless. And she's going to sneak in quietly while the rich people laugh, drop them into the plate, turn tail, scuttle back to her little house. So that's what she does. And Jesus spots her doing it and immortalises her. And here we are talking about her today, 2,000 years later in Nansen Road, just like we're talking about Auntie Sis. Someone most people would think it doesn't really matter. What was she worth? Not very much. What did she give? Not very much. But Jesus says she gave her all. We can all see what that really means. Now, I can't imagine that Jesus just let her go. I can't imagine that would happen. I bet he went over to her and had a chat, maybe took her out for a meal. I don't know, but I don't think she'd have been left. And until we meet her in heaven, we don't know. We will never know the answer to that question. So one of the things I always try to do in my life is really properly trusting God. You know, the way we're always told to trust in him. And often when we're having a chat, I'll say, here's insert everything that really bothers me. I'm giving it all to you. And I really mean it. And then a little while later, when nothing changes, I say, oh, actually, do you know what? I'll just take that thing I trusted with back. That's what I'll do. Anyone else? Is it just me? That's a relief. It's one of my main character flaws. I read a lot of Anne Lamott. I don't know if you've come across her. She's an amazing Christian writer. And she once said, a nun I knew once told me she kept begging God to take her character defects away from her. After years of this prayer, God finally got back to her. I'm not going to take anything away from you. You have to give it to me. But that's really hard. I really struggle with that. Now, the second story I want to tell you, I'm aware that I've been talking for 25 minutes. Don't worry. Yesterday they said talk as long as you like. I'm very aware that will not be happening today. It's okay. The second person I interviewed was a woman who used to work in the news department at Sky News. Great girl. I interviewed her in a coffee shop in London. She was in her 30s, and one day she went to a weekend conference organised by the anti-trafficking charity A21. You may have heard of them. And she sort of knew a bit about modern slavery, but she was horrified when she found out the extent of it. When I spoke to her back in 2011, there were more slaves then than when Wilberforce was working to abolish slavery, which is appalling. Around 27 million victims of trafficking worldwide. It's probably more now. And she was horrified, and she thought, as we always do when something huge and hideous comes up, what difference can I make? You know, you look at stuff like world famine and trafficking, and you think, well, what difference can one person make? And she prayed about it, and I've never forgotten these words. I use them constantly, I apply them to myself constantly. God said to her, use what is in your hand. Use what is in your hand. And she thought, right, okay, well, I work in the media, I'm really well connected, and I'm very sporty. So, and this is an amazing woman, she spoke to 4 of her friends, and they decided to row across the Atlantic. As you do. I mean, that's the absolute last thing. I might do a cake sale, you know. That's honestly, no rowing, thank you very much, I'm not built for that kind of thing. And then that wasn't enough, so she raised huge amounts of money, she raised huge amounts of awareness. And then she thought, you know what, that's not enough for me, so she then did something called Cycle for Freedom. She biked through 10 European countries in 27 days. I know. And arrived in London on Anti-Slavery Day, and she chose the European countries where most trafficked people come from. And I've often thought of that. If I'm overwhelmed by a problem, which happens a lot, I think, okay, Ruth, use what is in your hand. Or talking, that's very much my thing. We've all got God-given talents and gifts, and the great thing is they're all different. You know, I can make an okay cake, but I can no more row across the Atlantic than I could fly to the moon. That's never going to happen. But one of you might be really sporty and think, actually, yeah, I could do that. We're all different. Now, I had some very significant conversations yesterday after my talk yesterday, and I've written a really lovely talk for you all. And the Lord nudged me and said, nah, you're going to have to rewrite it, Ruth. I was like, right, okay, fine. So that's fine. And I really feel strongly that you need, or someone here needs encouragement. Real encouragement. Not the sort of thing where people are like, oh, you'll be fine, that's no good to anybody. Not wishy-washy encouragement. I'm talking about proper spiritual encouragement. So one more story, and then I promise I'll stop talking. Years and years ago, when I became a Christian, I was kind of one of those tick box Christians, you know, I'd sort of done SAT, so I knew I was going to heaven, it was basically okay, but people kept talking about this weird stuff about the Spirit and hearing God speak, and I was like, you what? You know, this wasn't really happening for me. So I went on an Alpha course, and the good Lord kicked me violently out the bottom all weekend at the Holy Spirit weekend. He kept saying, you've got to get baptised, and I kept saying, no, I'm not doing that. Absolutely not. I'm a Baptist born and bred, I know all about baptistries, I've been to any number of baptisms, and it was all lovely, but I could never imagine me being the one that was plunged into the water and came out and gave it all the chat. I wasn't the speaker then, but I am now. So anyway, I went to Alpha, and eventually, say, all right then, so I reluctantly said to the minister, I feel that God's telling you to be baptised. He went, oh great, that's great news. There are 7 other people in the church that also wish to be baptised. I thought, excellent, this is great. It's 8 of us, you know, I can just fade into the background, you know, I'll stand up, say some stuff about God and how he's great, and then sit down again. That was my plan. So off I went to the manse on Wednesday night to see Jerry and Ruth, the minister and his wife, and the other 7 people were there, and I felt very comfortable with this situation. So we all sat down, we had our first baptismal class, it was all jolly interesting, and I thought, okay, this is fine, this is going quite well. So the next week I went back, and there were only 6 of them. I was like, oh, and he said, so-and-so has decided not to be baptised at the moment. Very good reason. Okay, fine, there's still 7 of us. Every week, I kid you not, every week, it was almost like the Lord has a sense of humour, one less person. And I committed by then, I couldn't really say, you know what, changed my mind. And honestly, by the last year, it was just me. I was like, for goodness sake, great. So I thought, well, I've got to go ahead with it. You know, I'm going to have to do this thing. And at the end of our, whatever we were learning about, he said, okay, Ruth, so I was sitting in that, this was all very holy. He said, would you like me to pray that you will receive a spiritual gift as you were baptised? And in my head, a voice was going, no, thank you very much, I don't want one of those. What if I get one of the embarrassing ones? You know, one of those embarrassing Baptisty sorts where you have to jump up and shout stuff and then wait till I translate it or do something or fall over. I was like, no, I don't want one of those. But being a good girl, I was like, oh yes, that would be absolutely lovely. That is so much here. So 3 of us bowed our heads and assumed the shampoo position, and off we went, and he was praying for this gift. And in my head, and I'm in no way making this up, this is absolutely true, this is the kind of faith journey I have had, I was saying, now look, don't give me one of those embarrassing ones, alright, if you're going to give me one, that's great, but can you just give me a really quiet, low-key one. I can sort of quietly in the background, like kind of administrative gift maybe, you know, where I'm up the front. Okay, so that was that. So the next week it was baptism time. So at our Baptist church, you'd have a massive great service in the morning and everyone would talk about baptism that was coming in the evening. Everyone would show up. We would always sing Shine Jesus Shine, that was the Lord, obviously. And then in the evening you would turn up with all your friends and family and off you would go. So I was very nervous, as you can imagine. And, you know, I thought, oh, well, I just have to go through with it. And, you know, I did feel calm when it happened. So there I was in the pool. I was baptised, and then they all sang the song I'd chosen. This is a big church, probably about twice as big as this, and they were good singers. They were belting out some inspirational Baptist chorus. And there I am, standing up to my waist in the water. And I looked at Colin, who was my home group leader, who had baptised me, and he was kind of frowning and looking into the middle distance. And I said, "You all right, Colin?" He went, yeah. He said, I kind of feel that God's saying he wants to give you a spiritual gift. So I'm in front of the whole church. I was not saying, "Oh, Colin," so I was like, "Oh, how lovely." So in my head was down, I remember what I said. Do you remember we had this conversation? I said, "Nothing embarrassing, all right, nice low-key one." I said, "Oh, lovely, what is it?" He said, "I feel the Lord saying it's the gift of encouragement." I was like, "Yes, get in." The gift of encouragement, that's lovely. Low-key, quiet, I don't have to shout anything or fall over or wave my arms about. That's just the kind of gift that I would like to have. So out I came, you know, I was in Essex, I'm an Essex girl, so obviously I reapplied my makeup, did my hair, got a really nice outfit. And being Baptist, we were party types, so we had a big party in the hall at the back with tea and cake, and then we went back to mine where we partied well into the night and wine may have been taken. Anyway, the point of this story is that I didn't really know how spiritual gifts worked. In my head I knew, I got the kind of general idea of how it was meant to work. I knew that it was for building up other people and all that kind of thing, and it came from God. But I didn't know what it meant here. I didn't know what it meant when you got one. So there I was, standing by the hatch, you know, in our back hall, with a cup of tea in my hand, and people were coming up and saying nice things to me. And I had a very dear friend who I suppose you could say was my spiritual mentor. I really looked up to her. She was an incredibly faith-filled spiritual woman. And she had a very difficult life. Her husband was absolutely not a Christian. He gambled, they had no money. It was a very difficult time. She had 2 daughters. You know, it was hard. She was often struggling. Anyway, she came up to me and I could see that she'd been crying. She looked distressed. I thought, "Oh my goodness, what's the matter?" And she said, "Oh, you know, Keith again." So I gave her a big hug and then I just said some things to her. I can't remember what they were. And she sort of stood back from me and gave me this look. I said, "What?" She went, "Oh my goodness," she said. I said, "What?" She said, "Oh, you really have got the gift of encouragement." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "What you just said." I was like, "Oh, right, okay," because I just opened my mouth and some stuff came out. It wasn't that God took me over, it was definitely me speaking, but he literally gave me a gift, and not 10 minutes later I was using it. Now, it is, I suppose you could say that encouragement is one of the backroom gifts, if you want to say that. You know, it's not going to get lots of likes on Facebook, but it's such an amazing gift. Now, I spend a lot of my professional time writing about churches just like this one. They're usually gospel halls or little chapels, and they're usually on estates in towns. They're usually between 180 years old, and it's always pretty much the same story. You know, back in the day, they were huge, they had loads of children, they had loads of youth work, but one way or another, things have changed, society's changed, and they're down to the faithful few. And we always, the charity I work for, always gives them the same advice: reach out into your community. Now, I follow you on Facebook, I see what you do, I've known Hannah for years and she's told me what you do. Let me encourage you, Nansen Road Baptist Church, you are doing exactly what you are meant to be doing. Believe me, you are opening up this building to everybody on the estate and anybody who happens to walk by. That's what we're told to do. You are modelling Jesus for everybody here. That's what we're told to do. There might not be that many of you, does not matter. Be encouraged, you are doing exactly the right thing. Keep doing it, be faithful. If Jesus turned up, you'd give him a cream tea and you wouldn't ask any questions. Am I right? There you go. You are doing good for God's will. You are a bright light in this place. I can see that. And sometimes it takes a stranger, doesn't it, to walk in and see the place with fresh eyes. And that's what I'm doing today, and that's what I had to change about my talk, and to add in an extra. I can't give you the name of the person who spoke to me if you want to blame me for tacking on extra 10 minutes. So I'm going to finish with a quote from an Irish missionary, Amy Carmichael. You can give without loving, and that's true, but you cannot love without giving. That sounds a bit of a truism, doesn't it? But let's say it again. You can give without loving, and I think people do, but you cannot love without giving. Now, that doesn't have to be money. As I've said lots of times, we don't have to be rich to be generous givers. Look at the widow, the most generous giver in history, 2 tiny little coins. But you cannot love without giving. I want to be extravagantly generous. How about you? Thank you.
Thank you.